right, time to take you to Egypt once more now. The COP27 summit is expected to come to an end today. Yesterday, the president of COP27, Sameh, Shoukry, and the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres made an appeal to leaders of the negotiations to push for implementation of key agreements that were reached at the previous summits. Now, the developed countries are being criticized for pushing back on issues relating to financing. Sophie Mokoena is, of course, our international editor, and she joins us now from Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt. Sophie, good morning to you once more. So the COP27 president yesterday pointing out that some of the issues were not really seeing great progress. And just take us through some of those that were discussed.
Well, Sakina, indeed, yesterday the president of COP, in fact, earlier on I spoke to him. He was clear that the intention was to ensure that this summit is successful. But when you look at the pace in terms of negotiations, it's very, very slow. And that is why the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, had to come back here in Egypt to ensure that he's able to push the negotiators to really ensure that there's some success. But the president of COP yesterday, when he spoke with the when they were addressing the media with the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he pointed out that there are still issues that are not resolved in terms of mitigation, adaptation, financing, and a much controversial loss and damage issue. And he appealed to the negotiators to ensure that they are able to come up with a clear program of action and in terms of implementation. Let's take a listen at the president of COP when he spoke about those issues that are still outstanding.
I believe that extra efforts need to be exerted by all parties to ensure an agreement on this matter, one that would provide a basis that would allow us to effectively respond to the urgent and legitimate demand for an adequate funding setup for loss and damage at the earliest. We underscored the urgency of the ongoing climate crisis. I reiterated what was highlighted by His Excellency President Sisi at the opening ceremony of the Climate Implementation Summit on November the 7th. And I quote, "The world has become a stage for continuously running show of human misery and pain."
We are hoping that today we'll get a better sense in terms of where the talks are. We will try and speak to the chief negotiator from South Africa to find out whether they are making any progress on those issues highlighted by the president of COP.
General also expressed his frustration. Now, are we likely to hear better news today from what you've observed?
You are correct, Sakina. The Secretary General did express his frustration in terms of the slow pace. But before I answer whether we are likely to get better news, let's listen to what Antonio Guterres had to say. In fact, speaking directly not only to the negotiators but world leaders who are supposed to give a go-ahead for the chief negotiators to come up with a better action plan.
Renewables are the exit ramp from the climate hell highway. Third, the parties must act on the crucial question of finance. That means delivery of the $100 billion in climate finance for developing countries, clarity on how the doubling of adaptation finance will be delivered through a credible roadmap, and it means acting on the consensus to reform multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. Their business model needs to change to accept more risk and to systematically leverage private finance for developing countries at reasonable cost for climate action.
Well, clearly, Sakina, that's a tall order to reach agreement or agreements in those critical questions, because the issue of financing, the developed countries are saying that due to COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, it is not possible to really make new commitments. And the worrying factor is that it is not only the new commitments that needs to be implemented or agreed on, but the commitments that were made in Paris in 2015, the 100 billion, little has come up. And also in terms of what was agreed on in Glasgow last year, very few countries have honored their commitments and their pledges.
Sophie, just as we wrap this up, what have been the views expressed by others, those who are monitoring these negotiations? Because as you say, the implementation seems to be problematic, the richer countries pushing back, and that financing remains a sticking point. But what are the views of those monitoring the negotiations?
People are not happy that there was no progress. When you look at what civil society in particular are saying and activists, they are also worried that the issue of fossil fuels, there's no time frame in terms of the continent, Africa, to address that issue, because Africa is arguing that they still have to develop, and therefore they can't make commitments that will lead to job losses and poverty and small towns becoming ghost towns, particularly those countries that are struggling as we speak.
Well, Sophie, we'll leave it there for today. SABC News' international editor, Sophie Mokoena, who is speaking to us there from Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt, and this at COP27.